a motion about this House believes that politicians should not post about politics on their social media. It doesn't matter that much if you lose the clash on how Trump will be very sad because he cannot use his Twitter anymore. If you win the clash about how this is much better for politics and the overall state of democracy in society, which seems more important than an individual's use of Twitter. So not all clashes, just the important clashes. Next. If OO fails to respond to an argument made by OG, OO should place below OG. This is, again, false. Much in the vein of the previous question, if you fail to respond to an argument that is not very important, like how much Trump's Twitter matters to him, that's not as bad, because if you are still responding to other arguments that are more relevant or more important. Next. Completely new lines of argumentation brought up in DLO should be treated the same way as new material in a whip speech. This is not true. Whip speeches are treated in a special, unique way because they are the last speeches that each bench gets to make. After DLO is done, there are 2 closing halves and indeed 4 speeches. So it's not treated in the same way, so you can bring new material in DLO. That's completely fine. CG can place over OG even if they only provide new rebuttal and no substantive argumentation. As you can see in our really cool graph, this answer was a little bit more spicy because some people were a bit confused by this. Overall, we do value rebuttal as constructive material. So in a motion about this House prefers apples over oranges, if opening up gives strong argumentation about why we shouldn't prefer apples because they're poisonous and that's terrible, if you as closing government give a lot of responses to that, explain why they're not poisonous but they're indeed really healthy and good for people, even if that material is a response, that is still beating the constructive argumentation of opening opposition, and indeed it is providing constructive reasons for your own side. So even if a team only has new responses, that still means that they have an extension, that they can beat other teams in the round, and indeed that they can win the round. I hope this is relatively clear. Since this question had some weird answers, are there any questions on this question specifically? Okay, fantastic. Judges should make sure that the speaker points they give match the room's overall position on the tab, giving the highest peaks in higher rooms. I cannot stress this enough. This is false. Please, for the love of God, do not do this. Just because you are in a very high room doesn't mean that the speakers in it cannot also give a 65 every once in a while. Just because you're in a low room, that doesn't mean that those speakers aren't actually very, very much capable of giving very high 80s as well. So do not limit yourself because, you know, positions in the room does not reflect the height of the speaks. But also importantly, because you may think that you are in a room at a certain position in the tournament, you are probably wrong. You don't have that information, so please do not use that as a metric as to how high or how low your speaks should be. To win a debate, the opposition side must present an alternative for how to solve the problem presented by the government side. This is not true. The opposition only needs to prove that the government solution is not a good solution to the problem. They don't necessarily need to present an alternative. To give an example, on the motion this House would ban private healthcare, if opening government sets up the problem as there is a consistent failure in the providing of healthcare to the global population, and thus we think that banning private healthcare will fix this, opening up only needs to show that opening government solution, banning private healthcare, is not a good one to fix the problem. It may indeed worsen the situation that we currently have. They don't need to provide a solution. They're perfectly fine defending the status quo as a better option. Next question. Rebuttal does not need to be flagged as such for judges to take it into account. This is true. It is a bit annoying when speakers don't explicitly mention that it is a response, and ideally they should do this, and you can say in feedback that it might have been clearer if they had done that, but if it is indeed a response to the argument, they don't need to flag it as such, and it can still be a response to the argument that someone else makes. even if they don't explicitly say before that, this is a response to the argument that opening opposition has made in this debate. Debates become very confusing to judge if teams cannot agree on a common set of cases in which they apply. Therefore, unless the motion specifies otherwise, judges should assume that all debates take place within Western liberal democracies. I believe this was mentioned in the briefing that Ashish and Jasmine gave, and it was equally asked in a question from the audience. But to clarify, this is not true. Debates do not only happen in the West, in the UK, in France, in the United States. They also happen in many other countries across the world in which that motion is applicable. So just because teams cannot agree if this applies more in Indonesia or in Japan or in Mexico, that doesn't mean that you should unilaterally decide that they actually are all wrong and they take place in the United States of America. A CO that has failed to accept POIs from OG or offer POIs to them cannot place above OG. This is false. It's a bit annoying. If you are CO or if you're judging COs, they should in general engage with opening government, but it's not an automatic, you cannot beat opening government. In very close comparisons, it may come into play in your decision in terms of them not engaging with opening government as much as they probably should have. But at the end of the day, if their constructive argumentation and their extension is strong and beats opening government, just because they didn't take a POI, that's not a reason to give them an auto below OG. Next question. The allocation of speaker points should be based in equal proportion on style and on content. Again, this question caused a slight level of confusion. I do understand this because, as we mentioned before, style and content are evaluated in a holistic manner in terms of how persuasive does this in particular make you. But overall, they're not evaluated as separate. So you shouldn't be like, I think this is a 30 on style, but a 40 on content. You should instead consider holistic. You should instead consider both style and content as a holistic whole. So kind of like what Ashish was mentioning earlier, if I say this is bad, that's different than explaining into detail the suffering of individuals and how is it that it changes their lives. One of them might have better style, but at the end of the day, those are evaluated within the metric of persuasiveness rather than separately. On the motion, this House believes that gay parades do more harm than good to the LGBT+ community. CO makes the claim that gay parades are a manifestation of basic rights, and therefore banning them would be extremely oppressive and unjustified. If fully made and proven, this line is likely to be very strong in this debate. This, I think, is the highest level of confusion we have yet seen from this set of answers. This is not true. The reason for this comes back to what Ashish was getting into when he was talking about the different types of motions that exist. This House believes motions are not actually passing a policy. So opening government in this debate is not banning gay parades, and therefore closing opposition's argument about what happens if you ban them doesn't really stand in the debate, because they're opposing something that opening government is not actually doing. They're just discussing, on a thought scenario kind of way, does it bring more harms than good, without explicitly passing a policy for this. So that's why this particular argument does not apply. 13. Judges should discount a model or definition by opening government that are not in the spirit of the motion, even if they were not challenged by other teams in the room. This is not true. It's very different if it's something that is not in the spirit of the motion than if it's like explicitly a squirrel or them debating something that's completely wrong because the motion was legalized drugs and they're debating about giving free healthcare to everyone. This is different. I think that in this situation is something like this House believes that environmental disasters are legitimate grounds for military intervention. If the teams in the debate decide that they mostly want to debate that in a utilitarian metric, does this become better or worse for environmental disasters? That's fine. And just because you think that the CA team actually said this because they wanted teams to talk about the principles of intervention or non-intervention and why we should intervene and when we shouldn't, that doesn't mean that the teams in the debate are wrong. That's very different. So at the end of the day, you shouldn't discount a model based on what you think the CAs wanted us to debate. You don't know unless you talk to us personally. You probably don't know anyway. So just judge the debate that is set in front of you. Speeches do not need to meet every criterion described on a speaker scale bracket in order to receive a score in that bracket, and judges do not need to meet every criterion described on a judging scale bracket in order to receive a score in that bracket. This is indeed true. It's very difficult for a speaker or a judge to fulfill literally every characteristic listed, so just go, do they fulfill most of them, or do they look like they instead fulfill most of the criteria on a higher or a lower bar? So just go for overall rather than absolutism. We're over halfway there, guys. Good job. If judges are unable to understand a speaker due to accent, language, or similar considerations, they should attempt to reconstruct their speech in the most favorable manner. I would say this is false. The reason for this, and again, this caused some controversy in the answers, the reason for this is that that's also quite unfair to other teams. If you understand the other teams, but you are reconstructing someone else's argumentation for them, then that also puts the other teams at a disadvantage. What we say you should try to do is you have a panel for a reason, and other people will probably have read things and followed the debate in ways that you perhaps didn't. So that's why panel discussions are there. Much more than welcome to clarify with other panelists what the actual arguments made in the debate were. But overall, you should try to reconstruct the speech in the way that the speech was given, not in the most favorable manner. Principled arguments are, in general, more important than practical arguments, as they refer not only to what is likely to happen within the context of a specific debate, but to general moral truths. Therefore, these arguments should be credited more highly. So, as a response to this question, someone actually suggested that the CA team should be publicly shamed. That was, surprisingly, not the right answer. Overall, we would say that this answer is false. That is because you can't say that principles matter more in general or that practicals matter more in general. But rather, you say that the argument that is most important probably depends on A, the debate, but second and most importantly, the way in which teams argue these arguments and the way in which teams explain to you why a principle argument or a practical argument might matter more than the other one. If a judge has personal knowledge and a fact presented by OG is inaccurate, they should always treat it as false, even if it was not challenged by other teams. This is false. Just because you have a PhD in economics, that does not mean that the other teams in the round economic analysis is wrong. Just because someone spouts a fake science fact in front of me does not mean that I immediately go, they must auto-forth, their entire case is premised on this. You are an average, reasonable voter, and if other teams do not challenge that fact, I'm sorry, it is true for the purpose of the round. Just use the information that you as an average, reasonable voter would know. If someone claims China is not a real country and it does not exist, it's probably fine to say that is false. If someone gives you an in-depth fact about China that you know for a fact is not true because you happened to study that as your master's in university, please do discount that. If a team contradicts itself, judges should take only the first statement made and ignore the second one. This is the only effect that an internal contradiction would have. I will say that although high level of controversy in this one, this is probably the one that we're most okay with, particularly because this is indeed one of the effects that an internal contradiction would have. You would usually take the first statement that was made and not value the second one. However, the reason why this answer is wrong is because there are other effects that happen when this occurs. The most important one is that it reduces the persuasiveness of both arguments. If I simultaneously try to convince you that junk food is really good for you, but also destroys your internal organs and your health, that's quite bad, and overall that reduces the persuasiveness of both of those claims. So it is important instead so that's an important thing to take into consideration, and another effect. The third effect that we would say happens is that if you had any other argumentation that relied on the second claim, so if I have other further argumentation about how healthcare costs will go up if we eat loads of junk food that's reliant on my second claim of junk food being terrible for you, then that argumentation is discounted as well. Overall, teams should try to not contradict themselves because it's not persuasive, and these are the effects that accrue from that. When adjudication courts set motions, they have certain goals and areas of clash in mind. Probably true, but judges should therefore assess teams' relevance to the debate that should have happened, not only to the debate that occurred. This is absolutely false. We do indeed have certain goals and certain clashes and certain arguments that we think teams might make in mind, but if the debate that happens is a different one, but still a debate, that's completely fine. Again, in addition, it's very difficult for everyone at the competition to actually know what we thought about when setting the motion, which is why you should not assume that it was set for a particular set of reasons, but rather just judge the debate that was set in front of you. That's perfectly fine. Next question. A team that advanced new material in its web speech should be penalized in addition to the new material not being considered. This is false. Not considering the material that was given is already pretty damning. If you think about it, if a whip spends 2 minutes making a new argument, that's 2 minutes of that speech that are just gone. And to us, that's enough penalization. You don't need to take any further sanctions against the whip, so please no docking speaker points or anything like that. Just don't take that content into account in your assessment of the speech for both purposes of winning the round and also speaker scores. A team cannot win a debate solely on examples. This is the rare question in which the wrong answer actually got more answers. But overall, if you look carefully at the judging and debating manual, this is in fact false. And if you think about it for a second, if opening government stood up for 30 seconds, read the motion, and then sat down, and closing government comes and explains examples in which this has happened, that's probably more persuasive than what opening government did. And therefore it counts as material. In a less extreme example, we do think that overall providing examples and explaining why those examples occurred, that's also analyzing what is essentially an example, but that's also material. At the end of the day, it does count as new things that you have brought for your team, and therefore should be counted. As this question caused some controversy in the answers, I'm happy to take a question about it now if anyone has a specific one. Okay, perfect. Next. If a motion is phrased as a this house believes motion, non-consequentialist arguments are particularly important. In an actor motion, this house as X would, they are irrelevant as we are discussing only what benefits a specific actor. This is false. As I described earlier, principled or practical arguments matter depending on the debate and also on the way that teams argue principles and practicalities. But in particular in this one, in this house believes that something causes more harm than good. You can both talk about, for example, the practical harms and equally the principled issues. Harms and practicals and principles also come into play. But equally, on a this house as X would, sure, you as an actor probably have material concerns that lend itself to practical considerations, but equally, you can argue that a particular actor has particular strong moral principles that mean that we should care about this principle in particular, which is why these things still come into play in actor debates as well as in this house beliefs debates. If a counterprop is made by OO and not challenged by OG, both closing teams should compare the motion with the counterprop as opposed to status quo. This is true. This is for several reasons, including but not being limited to not scoring over opening opposition. But I think that at the end of the day, it's easy to conceptualize as the opposition bench as a whole is defending a particular conception of the world, and that conception has to be the same both for opening up and for closing opposition. So to give an example, if the motion is this house would heavily tax all junk food, and opening government argues that this is good because it increases the price of junk food and means that people are less likely to buy it, which is good because it's very bad for them. Opening up has the ability to propose a counterprop, to say, for example, that they agree with opening government, and that is why, instead of increasing the price but still having it available, what you should do is ban junk food. That means that closing teams don't have to compare to a perception of the world in which junk food still exists, but rather they have to compare with the perception of the world that opening up has presented, which in this case would be a world in which junk food is banned, and explained why their particular world is better or worse. If CG provides a new metric to explain why opening government beat opening opposition, this does not constitute an extension. This is false. Extensions are many, many things, and this is one of them. At the end of the day, if you as closing government do a very, very good job of giving several different reasons as to why opening opposition's material is not really in the debate, and why actually opening government's material is much more important, explaining why something is important is still giving analytical reasons that help you in the debate. Because without those reasons, you know, that material is probably less impactful, you're not considering it as much. So at the end of the day, it is still explanation, it is still analysis, it is still an extension. The last question. On the motion, this House would pay additional money to families on welfare whose children excel in school. It is legitimate for opening opposition to suggest spending the same amount of money to improve school infrastructures. This is true. Opening opposition has the ability to take the equivalent amount of opening government fiat to do something that is different. Obviously, it has to be mutually exclusive, and it has to solve the problem. They can't just randomly decide to take the money and buy a load of ponies, but they do have the ability to propose a solution to the problem that OG is identifying that is different. Much in the vein of if opening government wants to tax fast food and junk food, opening opposition has the ability to take that fiat and say, we would instead ban it. I hope that this is clear. Are there any questions at all over any of the true and false questions? I see one over there. Oh, thanks, Ayala.
Who had that question? Yeah, thank you. So, this is loud. In the DLO, I think it's number 4, it was mentioned that the DLO should not be judged as a whip. I'm assuming that's for new content. Now, what if the DLO manages to successfully reframe a debate without contradicting the case majorly? How does the judge then treat it?
If the DLO manages to successfully reframe the debate without contradicting LO, that's fine. LO might say, you know, this applies in non-Western liberal democracies only. If DLO happens to say, you know what, we're going to engage with opening governments, all countries in the world, for an even if scenario, that is a reframe of the debate, a reframe of the arguments, but it's not explicitly contradicting the material that LO has said. So as long as it's not an explicit contradiction, reframes are fine. They're just broadening the debate and explaining how it applies to other factors. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Ashish, can you click back to question 23, please?
Okay.
Yes.
So my question here is, why is it that both the closing teams get to engage only with the counter prop and not with the case that OG gave in the first place? Like, how is that fair to OG?
Oh, no. You still engage with opening government's case.
Okay.
But basically you're comparing opening government's case against opening opposition's solution. So in this case, if opening government says, I propose we should tax fast food, and opening opposition says, I propose we ban it, then if you're closing government, you're still defending opening government's case. You're still saying we should definitely tax it. You're just comparing it with opening up and saying, this is why taxing it is much better than outright banning it. Okay. So yeah, you're comparing both of those cases. Obviously, opening government, this is a situation in which opening government didn't challenge the mechanism, but if an opening government chooses to challenge it, that's a different thing altogether.
Thank you.
Is that more or less clear?
Yeah. Works.
Okay, anything else? Cool.
Okay, awesome. So now Ayal has the floor.
Yeah. Okay, so, wait, I'll need to adjust the mic. So, I know we've been here a while, but I still ask you to bear with me for this last part of the wacky scenarios we threw on you in the judge test. So, we're going to go through those. You're judging a debate in which opening government has stronger substantive argumentation than opening opposition, but opening opposition, besides its argumentation, effectively rebuts all of opening government's arguments. Member of government then spends their extension speech refuting OO's case and rebuttals and showing why they do not stand. Based on this information, which of the following is true? So, essentially, the true answers here are 1, opening opposition has defeated opening government points. The reason for that is basically, even if opening government had better so-called substantive material, at the point where top half ends, this substantive material no longer stands since it has been rebutted effectively by opening opposition, as the question states. What that means is that opening opposition's positive argumentation, even if weaker initially than opening government's, still wins because they have also managed to mitigate or refute all of opening government's substantive points. This is not influenced, and this is important to mention, by the fact that later on in the debate, member of government had some responses or some rebuttals to the opening opposition's case. Meaning, and that's the second answer that's correct, closing government's rebuttal should not affect the call within top half. And that's a general principle that no matter, basically the decision between top half teams can be made at the point where top half ends. What member of government, member of opposition, any whip speaker has said can obviously influence the position of that team. It can influence their position relative to top half teams. It cannot influence the call between those two top half teams. Okay, next question. Okay, this is slightly long. Basically, the scenario is, in the motion, this House would give large municipalities control over law enforcement, immigration, and housing policy. Opening government claims that large municipalities are likely to be more liberal and tolerant than other parts of the country because of economic and cultural factors, and therefore they are more likely to promote liberal reforms and values. Opening opposition counters by noting that some municipalities can be very illiberal and racist, citing various examples, and claims that therefore they are likely to implement worse policies after the motion is passed. Closing government claims that regardless of which policies they pursue, municipalities have a right to manage these areas of policy by themselves. CO add nothing of consequence. Which of the following is true? So this is an interesting one. Essentially what happens here is opening government is claiming a comparative. Opening government is claiming that not that these places are always going to be liberal. What they are claiming is that there is a comparative here between two scenarios. In one scenario, policy is decided by the country at large. That means both the people of the municipality voting and the rest of the people of that country. Within that context, their claim is people in the municipality are likely to be more liberal than the rest of the people within the country. Opening opposition's claim that says basically municipalities can also be illiberal does not engage with this comparative. The reason it does not is it can be true that they are illiberal and at the same time that they are more liberal than other parts of that country. Therefore, opening government's claim still holds. That is the reason that opening opposition's claim here defeats opening government's claim defeats opening opposition's claim. Now, to go over two additional things here. One, obviously, you cannot decide as a judge what clash is more important. That is left up to teams. As we said, you're not supposed to be interventionist within the debate. Therefore, answer C, that says that promoting liberalism and tolerance is more important, and therefore top half should place above closing government, is untrue. However, in the same way, placing closing government over opening half is also untrue, at least in the reason given here. It is possible for closing government to explain and justify why their clash is the more important one, meaning the rights of municipalities. However, it is not the case. What it says here is basically they should place over opening half, since their extension is true no matter who wins the clash in top half. If you basically take this in abstract, what this basically says is they win because they've talked about a different clash. Sometimes it is the case that something is a deadlock in top half. Really, two teams are completely tied on a clash, and therefore bringing a different clash is something that wins you the debate. This is, however, not necessarily the case. In this case, opening government wins that clash over opening opposition. The fact, therefore, that opening government had
the fact that closing government spoke about something else does not in itself mean that they win. Finally, obviously, it is not a contradiction from closing government to offer a different metric for the debate than opening government. So that is not a knife. Are there any questions about that? Yes. Could you hand the mic? I can't really hear the...
I'm just asking if you can explain again why it's uncomparative.
Yes. So essentially, opening government claims municipalities are more liberal than other parts of the country. Opening opposition replies they can still be illiberal. Both of these things can be true at the same time, right? They can be quite illiberal, but still more liberal than other parts of that country. In the comparative, all of the country votes on policy, here just the municipality does. And therefore, even if they are still illiberal, they can still be more liberal and have more liberal policies than the country put together. Okay, next one. Okay, this is a simpler one, and luckily almost everyone agrees on what is the right answer here. Basically, you are judging, you disagree with your wings significantly. In this case, if you have two wings and a trainee, your two wings vote against you, that is the call of that panel. Notice, it is fine to ask for an extension of several minutes in order to continue your deliberation. However, taking as long as you need is something that holds the entire tournament back, is unfair to other rooms, because basically these teams in your room are getting more judging time and more deliberation time than other teams are, plus you might keep us as the edge core behind on schedule. You do not want to do that. We will be quite angry with you. So basically, and obviously, you do not, as a judge, have complete veto power as a chair over what happens in the discussion, meaning even if you really strongly feel that some call is correct, your panel outvotes you, that is their choice to make. In the same way, the fact that you cannot decide on your own to promote a trainee to a wing status, that is a decision made by the adjudication core and not by the judge in the room. So this is also wrong. And finally, compromise in a panel decision is not a reasonable scenario. Meaning, if you think that a team is first, then you would not also believe they are second. Making that compromise would not be a legitimate move to make. Yes, next one, please. Lucia, could you give me the next slide? Thank you. Okay. On the motion that this House believes that the West should heavily reduce economic cooperation with China, opening government points out many immoral acts committed by China, internally and internationally, and claims that the West has a moral obligation not to be complicit in these acts. Opening opposition claims that China's behavior is likely to worsen as a result of this motion. Closing government claims that it is in the interest of the West to weaken China, which is currently on its way to become a global rival to the US. CO claims that given the economic situation in the West and its dependence on China for many consumer goods, Western countries are unlikely to take part in such a policy, assuming all teams prove their claims, which is true. So none of the answers here are true. Let us go over one by one and explain why, because this might be important. So, closing government extension is strong in the round since it directly addresses the interests of the West. This is wrong given this is not this House as the West, but this House believes that the West should. As we said, this happens from a neutral observer perspective. That means the West is obviously an actor within this debate, but not necessarily the most important or the crucial actor there. OG's principle of not aiding and abetting, not aiding immoral action is a fundamental one and outweighs OO's consequential response. As we have said, this is not an absolute thing. If OG wants to explain to us why their principle outweighs the practicalities, that's fine and a very good strategy within debate. But if they don't do that, we as judges do not take an interventionist approach and say, oh, they made a principle, therefore this is more important than this practicality. Just in the same way, we don't do the opposite either. We don't say, oh, they had harm or they didn't, and therefore opening opposition defeats opening government. Then on CO's extension, essentially what CO's extension does is go against prop fiat. Because what the motion is, this House believes that the West should do this policy. CO's extension is, the West is unlikely to do this policy. That is just as illegitimate as saying, for example, this, in a normal policy motion, this House would legalize all drugs. This would never pass in Parliament. These two things are logically equivalent, and this is not something that in this debate, for debates of this sort of function, we have to assume that the West actually takes the policy as the actor in question. Finally, we do not, obviously, as judges, come and prioritize clashes ourselves. That is, saying that closing government is selfishly focusing on the interest of the West, and that's very bad, and therefore we should punish them, is obviously not something we as judges are supposed to do. Okay, let's go to the next one. Okay, you're chairing around, an argument has been made that you believe constitutes an equity violation. What do? Essentially, judges are not equity officers of the tournament. There is an equity team that has an equity policy in place and has the mechanisms to deal with equity violations. Generally speaking, what you're supposed to do is judge the debate normally. If you feel that an equity violation has been committed, you approach the equity team, you approach, if you want, the speaker themselves to tell them this thing that they've said you believe is problematic or has offended you. All these are fine. You do not, however, intervene yourself within the debate, stop the debate in the middle, or obviously disregard that because you believe this was an disregard the argument because you believe it's an equity violation. Note, obviously there's one caveat to this, which is if this is something that does not allow the debate to continue happening. Let's say this argument is just screaming at another team, refusing to sit down, anything like that, that is obviously something that becomes a disruption to the debate to the level that you may have to stop the clock. Generally speaking, however, this is the policy that you should follow as a judge in this scenario. Let's go to the next one. Okay. On the motion that House would legalize marijuana, opening government, basically, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but basically, opening government defines the mechanism as only applying to people suffering from acute pain with a doctor's approval, and also to people who are over 18. Opening opposition, say this is a squirrel, and then talk about why it's very bad for teenagers to be on drugs. And closing government says, gives a case that explains why accept oral challenge and gives reasons why it would be good for marijuana to be legal for everyone, including teenagers. So essentially, Oral's challenge is partially correct here, meaning one of the things opening government has said is illegitimate. It is not legitimate to exclude the common case within a motion, or to leave within a motion just the rare cases. So if the motion says this House would legalize marijuana, you want to debate this at the level of the generality of the actual motion, that is not limiting it only to people who have severe pain. However, limiting it and saying we will not allow this for children is completely legitimate. They are definitely a rare and unique case within this debate. So part of it is valid, another part is not. Besides that, just a second, no, still in the, okay, cool. CG's line, if done well, is likely to be quite important within this debate. Notice, it is true that as a judge, you should still consider this motion as not applying specifically to teenagers. However, if closing government's case says why it would be good for everyone, including teenagers, that is still something that is very valuable within this debate, because they are defending the whole scope of the motion, which opening government presumably did not do, and that is therefore an important line of argumentation within this debate. Okay, is there a question on this? Okay, question there. Who has the mic? Who has the microphone? Yeah, I just want to make sure we go over this because I know some of these scenarios are quite complex.
Again?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, the person standing there. Ashish.
If the motion was this House would legalize, say, heroin or cocaine, do you think the restriction to acute pain would be something that is legitimate for OG to do?
No. If the motion was this House would legalize heroin, end of sentence, then this would have to actually legalize heroin for everyone. If this House would legalize heroin for people who are terminally ill, then obviously you have to pay then obviously you can debate that, and you don't have to extend it to everyone else. Okay, next slide. Okay, so on the motion, this House would pay reparations to women. Basically what we have here, I'm not going to read the entire thing, but essentially what we have here is a very flowery language rephrasing by closing government of what opening government has said. There is one sentence here that could potentially be considered an extension, and we basically did not discredit significantly answers that said that. However, we do think that the more proper thing to say here would be that closing government did not in fact have an extension. The part that is potentially new is saying specifically that, just a second, receiving monetary compensation will allow these women to empower themselves and enjoy a more adequate quality of life. However, in opening government, we do have the statement that says that the state owes it to women to make their lives better and pay them back for the harms that they have been through. Meaning, the claim that money can make these women's lives better does in fact appear in the opening government case. The word empowering them does appear there. The statement is made in different sentence structurally in the language. However, that does not constitute a meaningful extension given there's literally a few additional words there. The reason we used quotes is you should assume that this is basically the entire argument as it was given. Therefore, this is not a meaningful extension by closing government over opening government. Obviously, their engagement with the opposition bench can matter very much on the way they're placed. We haven't given here the entire speech. It is possible that actually the opposition bench is winning this debate and not opening government, and in that sense, rebuttal provided by closing government to opening opposition could be a very, very important thing that might even place them ahead of opening government, despite the fact that they did not have a meaningful extension. Okay, let's go to the next one. Okay, on the motion that this House would legalize gambling, so basically what we have here is a question of, first of all, the extent to which closing opposition has extended over opening opposition, and secondly, the question of new material and what should be and should not be treated as new material coming within a whip speech. So first of all, closing opposition does have an extension within this motion. Opening opposition says this will lead to crime because people will become addicted. Closing opposition says this will lead to crime because just a second, because this makes money laundering easier. While these two things lead to the same conclusion, they do so through different mechanisms and different explanations. Therefore, that is definitely a valid extension in and of itself. It would not be true within this context to say that closing opposition does not have an extension. More importantly, though, in terms of the lines in the opposition whip, essentially one of these lines is a completely new analysis. The first line that says why criminal organizations are more likely to be the ones running those casinos. While it's an interesting and maybe valid argument, it is not something that was brought up before by anyone. It leads to the same bottom line, but again through a completely different set of argumentation, a different analysis. So that is something that is not valid to do. However, impacting an already existing case is something that's completely legitimate for an opposition whip to do. That is actually one of the jobs of a whip, to impact cases. And here what the whip is doing is both impacting a case, explaining here is another harm of the analysis we've already provided, and also explaining why this engages with the case coming from governments, meaning the case that this will make the economy better. Both of these things are valid as something that an opposition whip can say. So just to conclude, the first thing there is completely new material, should be disregarded. The second line of argumentation is fine and something that the whip speaker is allowed to do. Questions on that? Cool. Next one. Okay. Again, definitely not going to read the whole thing, but essentially, there are two things here among these answers that are correct. One, opening government, one is that closing government's case is knifing opening government. The reason for that is the following. Opening government's claim was that following this motion, there are going to be more high-skilled immigrants coming into the United States of America. The premise for closing government's case was, following this motion, there are likely to be less highly skilled immigrants coming into the United States of America. These two are diametrically opposed. You cannot have both. This is directly contradictory, and therefore this cannot be considered an extension. Some people said this is something that's fine if the team said even if before their case. Sometimes saying the words even if can be enough. If you're just saying, well, maybe this scenario will happen, maybe this scenario will happen. However, even if is not completely a magic word. If what you're doing is basically making a case that is the complete opposite of your opening, that would still not be a valid thing to do. Specifically here, if you think again in the metric of fairness, what ends up happening here is opening opposition made a claim to counter opening government, meaning opening opposition claimed that there are going to be less highly skilled immigrants coming in, and then closing government say, yes, we agree with opening opposition, but that's very good because of this other set of reasons. That is very, very problematic thing to do within that debate. Again, on both answers C and D, so on question C, answer C, it is not the job of us as judges to prioritize argumentation and to prioritize clashes. Meaning, even if we think that the most vulnerable people are the most important in this debate, this is not our job to say this unless teams have explained to us why this thing is true. We may be personally sympathetic to this, but this is not a reason for us to prioritize one argument over the other. About question D, again, disagreeing on metrics is fine. Closing opposition saying this thing that we are analyzing is more important than what opening opposition is analyzing is fine and not a knife. However, specifically within this debate, this is a comparative debate between two scenarios. One of them is a scenario where the United States takes in people just based on merit. The other side, the side opposition is defending, by the words of the motion, is the United States taking in family members of people who are already within the United States. Neither of these groups are immigrants or refugees. Therefore, closing opposition's line about we should take in more refugees or immigrants, even if analyzed very well, is unlikely to be important within this debate since it is outside of the main comparative being proposed by the motion. Meaning, unless they can show that these refugees or immigrants are likely to be relatives of people currently living within the United States, that is not a line that is likely to win in the debate. Let's move on to the next one. Okay, so here what we have is basically, okay, question on the previous one.
It's fine, it's just for the people at the back.
Yeah, this room is larger than it seems.
I just want to know why, given that CO does not give a argument that's not comparative in the debate, despite that CO's argument is not a knife. Why is it not a knife?
Oh, it's not a knife because they don't contradict anything that other teams have said. It's just irrelevant regardless of whether it's a knife or not. Like, it's not, the reason it's disregarded is not because it's a knife. Like, a knife would be if they said, opening opposition, this fact claimed by opening opposition, or this thing claimed by opening opposition is in fact wrong, or argued from a different premise, a completely different premise from the OO case. Here, they're not contradicting them, they're just talking about something irrelevant. For example, if they were talking about why we should invade Iran, that would not be a knife to OO, that would just be a completely irrelevant line within this debate, and the same basically can be said here.
But the course of action is different, right? They're choosing, so they're just not saying the word we oppose what you're saying, but they're in effect using those 14 minutes to argue something that's very different from what their opening argued.
Okay, so two ways of addressing this, and then so you could, if you mean by this that they're talking about a different scenario, meaning something that's completely not in this debate, then again, I think this is a semantic thing, basically. Like, they're not knifing, they're just being off clash or irrelevant in a different way. If what you mean is they're knifing because they're talking about saying we should prioritize a different population or a different group, that specifically is fine for them to do. If that was not the case, it would be very, very hard for a closing team to beat their opening, because opening could always say, the thing we're talking about is the most important, this one tiny clash, you as closing can't contradict us on this, so basically you're screwed.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Cool. Great. So on the, basically here what we have is quite a straightforward exchange of argumentation. Opening government says, here are reasons why appointing female priests is going to be very good for the status of women within society, and they give the following thing. They say, faith and church play an important part in many people's lives. When religious men and women interact daily with women in a position of religious authority, they are likely to develop a better, more empowering perception regarding the role of women in society in general. And in addition, female priests will be more able to respond to the needs of women within their communities. And opening opposition basically says, or leader of opposition basically says, this is going to worsen the perception since it's something that's forced on these women. So the reason, so basically this argument does engage and mitigate the strength of the Prime Minister's speech, but does not completely refute it. The reasons for that is twofold. One, obviously, they do not tackle at all the claim that says, here is why this would be, like these women would be more suitable to address the needs of other women within that community. Like female priests will be more able to cater to the needs of other, of women worshippers within the community. That is something that goes unengaged with. But more than that, it is not the case, even if this argument is not on the table, this is still not fully defeating the argument. Given that, they don't say to me, they don't necessarily go to prove, just by saying this, they don't necessarily go to prove in opening opposition that nobody is going to create a better perception or develop a better perception of women. Essentially, this is what we call competing analysis, meaning they have, opening government says this thing is true, opening opposition says, no, this thing is true. They're not exactly taking the logic as presented by opening government and refuting that and explaining why that is wrong. Meaning, for example, I could say, as a judge, hearing these two arguments, I'm still left with a lot of questions. I'm still left asking myself, is this something that's been completely refuted? Or, for example, is it the case that over a long period of time, maybe this normalization effect still happens? I'm not sure, and therefore this is not something that has completely rebutted the argument. Let's go on to the next one. Could you give me the next slide? Okay. So, in a debate where both opening government and opening opposition have each won one clash, there are several things we can do in order to decide between these clashes, assuming, of course, the teams have not done so themselves. Ideally, we would want the teams to explain why the clashes they win are the most important. But if that has not happened, there are four things that mentioned here that we can take as judges into account. First of all is the extent to which each side won their clash. What I mean by that is obviously both sides have won, but there is a difference between, for example, proving to me in harms that, I don't know, this will cause 100 people to die or this will cause 1,000 people to die. That may be quite different. They may prove that this will lead to less faith in the democratic system. They may prove civil war. The extent and the level of harm that's been proven, or the level of moral persuasion that's been proven, or anything like that, is something that's very determinative. For example, let's say one team has proven has won their clash but proven quite a small impact, or won it by not such large margin, then obviously this is something we can factor in. Secondly, we can also factor in, obviously, the engagement both teams provided. Like, even if the other team ended up winning the clash, how much did the other team push back against this clash? What have they said? How good was their engagement and their rebuttal, including the POIs they have given to each other? Thirdly, we also want to look at implicit statements made by those speakers. Meaning, even if they don't weigh directly, they may say certain things on why one thing is more important than another. We should be mindful as judges of those statements, even if they were not meant to be prioritization. Obviously, it would be preferable if a team has made an explicit prioritization. We would prefer that. But if a team has not, and has left us the job of weighing, then implicit statements they've made may be used as part of that weighing process. Finally, let's imagine a scenario where the great majority of the winning arguments in opening opposition only came in the deputy leader of opposition, and the deputy leader of opposition did not take a POI from opening government. That is obviously something we would take into account quite significantly when we're weighing these two teams, meaning if they are so, quote unquote tied in other ways, we would obviously look at the amount of which opening government even had the chance to engage with opening opposition. Obviously, the other things here are not true. Style, intellectual rigor, teamwork, all these things are very nice concepts. They are not well defined within BP debating. They should not be used as a way of prioritizing arguments and saying this team is won because they had more intellectual rigor. That is just not something we do. The rebuttal offered by closing half teams is obviously not supposed to influence the call within top half. The fact that there was a very good CO that rebutted OG should not matter to what happens between OG and OO. Obviously, giving the win to a team from a less privileged institution, while I appreciate the sentiment, is not something that's fair to do for us as judges. That is like, I would say, meta-interventionism that you are definitely not supposed to be doing in any way. Okay, let's go to the next one. Okay, this house, as South Korea, would develop nuclear weapons. Opening government, basically the scenario is opening government contradicts itself. Opening opposition claim that North Korea does not have nuclear weapons. Closing opposition says they do, and this will lead to this and this harms. A few things here. So a few things on CO. It is true that CO is not obligated to be consistent with a clearly false factual statement. And we do believe that saying North Korea does not have nuclear weapons at this current point in time is an unreasonable statement that the average intelligent voter would not likely accept. They have made several nuclear tests. This has been widely reported on the news and so on. Therefore, claiming this is something that is okay for closing opposition to disregard. However, quite a few people answered that closing opposition is okay to ignore opening opposition since their arguments have been effectively refuted by opening government. That is not a legitimate cause for knifing your opening team. Meaning the fact that they have been rebutted by someone does not mean you get a free pass to just ignore that argumentation or say the exact opposite of that argumentation. That's not how consistency works. And on the other hand, it is not in fact a knife. In terms of opening government, basically opening government have an internal contradiction within their case. This means two things. One, it means that that any benefit they would have derived from the second argument, the second contradictory argument, is taken away, meaning anything that they have said about why, anything that they benefit from saying that nuclear deterrence doesn't work is something they will not be credited with. But on the other hand, they have also literally rebutted themselves, meaning the Deputy Prime Minister has presented effective rebuttal to the Prime Minister's claims. This is not something judges are supposed to ignore. They do take this into account to the extent that this has been a rebuttal and actual damage to the case brought by the the Prime Minister. Okay, last one. We are almost done at this point. Okay. On the motion, this House would abolish all sin taxes. Opening government says why sin taxes on alcohol and tobacco are very problematic for these and these reasons. Opening opposition say, we agree with you, but here's this other sin tax that's completely fine and should be kept. In this scenario, that is fine for opening opposition to just argue on the grounds they choose. The reason for that is the motion says abolish all sin taxes, and it is okay for opening opposition to say, government doesn't win on saying abolishing some. It is fine for opening opposition to take the stance that say, yes, we maybe should abolish some, but not all of them. Now, it was pointed out in several responses that we may have had a slight inaccuracy linguistically, where a tax on gasoline is not in fact a sin tax. People who have made that response, and obviously that has significantly changed the way in which this question is scored. Because if this is not a valid counterprop, or valid stance for opening opposition to take, then obviously this changes quite significantly the way the debate works. We have taken this into account whenever anyone explained this to us in the open answers. However, assuming for a second this is, and that the syntax on gasoline is something that is legitimate for opening opposition to defend, what ends up happening is basically at the point where we have a counterprop and a concession from opening opposition, extending on that concession is meaningless within the debate. Basically, the debate has now become only about, at the point where open government has said we're fine with having with abolishing syntaxes on tobacco and alcohol, any extension on explaining why tobacco and alcohol would be actually a good thing to ban, or like a good thing to remove syntaxes from, or a good thing to retain syntaxes from, is off clash. Meaning the debate is now shifted, the burdens in debate have now shifted in a significant way at the point where opening opposition has said, that is okay with us. Both sides in the debate now agree that these syntaxes should be removed. Therefore, both an extension from closing government on why, a further extension on why removing these syntaxes would be a good thing, or any further extension from closing opposition on why removing them would be a bad thing, are off clash within the debate, since this has already been conceded that these syntaxes should be taken away. Okay, this is essentially everything we had to tell you about the judge test. Are there any final questions before we depart? Yes. Okay, I see there are a few. I will probably need one of you to travel with a microphone to the different, yes. Turn it on, there's a button.
Oh. Hello. So would the score of the adjudication test be considered while determining the adjudicator break, or it is only determining who is going to panel, trainee, or chair in the round 1 or in the earlier rounds?
Okay, so the results of the test score are going to be factored in quite significantly. Obviously, they're not going to be the only factor by which we decide the advancement of judges within this tournament. We have multiple ways in which we do this. Initially, in round 1, there is a mix between the CV score, meaning the previous experience of a judge, and the results on the judge test. Obviously, as rounds progress, that is feedback that judges get becomes more and more important and gains more weight as the tournament progresses. We think that feedback is a much more useful tool than both these other tools. The more information you give us, the better we will be able to assess judges. Essentially, the importance and relevance of both the judge test and CV reduces as rounds progress. What that means is, even if you feel you did not do well on the judge test following these answers, this doesn't matter. This is not catastrophic. This does not mean you are precluded from the break or anything of that sort. Also, if you had a wonderful judge test, that also does not mean you are automatically breaking now. Obviously, do well in the tournament itself, judge well, get good feedback. This is the most important thing we're going to be valuing.
As another thing to note on that one, it's also weighted, so we are trying to give opportunities to people who haven't judged that much but maybe are amazing judges. So if you don't think that you have that much of a CV, don't worry about it. We are weighing test scores much more heavily if you don't have that much previous experience. There's very complicated algorithms that we have put a lot of thought into in terms of how to evaluate judges. If you think that's fun, come talk to us.
Cool. Okay, further questions? Yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted to go back to question 1, and one of the answers that was marked as correct said that rebuttals to OO's rebuttals should count, and I was wondering if that meant that it counted towards the opening half call.
Oh,
that was an accident. That was me being dumb when making the presentation and accidentally bolding 2 of them. When we release the presentation, that's fixed. Only one answer is correct for that one, but yes. Good spot.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. No, this answer is not correct.
Oh, okay, great. 4 questions for the price of 1.
Okay, excellent.
Good spot, 4 people. Great.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. Do come to us if you have any further questions, and good luck in the tournament. Thank you.
you don't know where to go, it's lunchtime. Lunchtime is the plaza. Just ask the volunteer to find where the plaza is. There is a council meeting which is held at 12. So those of you who are involved in the council meeting is upstairs. You take the stairs up and you go left. You will go to this room called the UNESCO Council Room. Thank you.